So what India is doing now is to really reach out to countries with which it has, more complementarity, more, convergences politically.
So, in this week's column, the big news internationally has been the interim trade deal, the interim deal with Australia, which we're hoping blossoms into a proper free trade agreement sooner rather than later, as well as the sale of the BrahMos missiles to the Philippines by India. So both these things you point out in your column and how they represent a sort of moving forward in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the US strategy document in the Indo-Pacific. The first things of the sense one gets is that while both say India is engaging with defense exports to countries that are also having trouble with China, as well as the FTA, on both, while this is an interesting step, but like what you and a good step, that it's just very slow moving on both. And what can be done to address that sort of? I mean, right now it's an interim deal with Japan, with Australia. We have so much more to do with, say, non-US allies or non-US partners in the region, and we don't seem to be moving fast enough. Is there some truth to that?
No, I think the problem for India has been, on trade. When this government came, they shifted out of, the previous government's commitments to FTAs, and it reviewed all of them all around. And the conclusion was that they've actually harmed India's manufacturing capacity. While many trade theorists would question this, but the judgment had been made, and India also decided to walk out of the RCEP. So what India is doing now is to really reach out to countries with which it has, more complementarity, more, convergences politically. So those are the ones it is doing it with. And for example, Australia is only one. They plan to do one with the UAE. In fact, there is news that next week, when the Prime Minister meet the UAE leadership virtually, this could be one of the items that's on the agenda. Israel is supposed to be close, and UK, where the serious negotiations have begun, and there's speculation we'll do something by the end of the year. In some extent, yes, these are all closer to the US. But the logic for us is, are they complementary? That is, while in Asia, the RCEP with China, it's really where they already have an advantage in manufacturing, and they simply undercut India. With these countries, it is a far more, mutually beneficial relationship. Those countries are not competing with India's production. India is not, disadvantaged with it. So at least in some direction, they're moving. Whether that can be expanded to cover a larger number of countries, we will see. But you needed to demonstrate, look, India is not anti-trade. India is not anti-trade liberalization. To that extent, what we're doing today is a step forward.
There's a sense, just to stay on trade before we move on, one second, is that even with, say, what's with the Ukraine crisis, with China, there is a sense that China, and even Russia to a far lesser extent, but China certainly has managed to, its strategy was that even countries where it does not share values with and is in some kind of conflict with or the other, either ideological or, in fact, physical conflict, military confrontation, is that you still have to do business with China. Is that you use the trade relationship or the economic relationship to leverage yourself in the strategic domain. Whereas is India doing enough of that, or are we still looking at, say, even if you say, are we a little, in terms of national self-interest on trade, are we a little too particular about who we're going to be trading with or what kind of trade it's going to be? And are we looking at it too much through a strategic lens when it comes to trade?
No, I don't think we are looking at purely through the strategic lens. I think the context in which China grew so rapidly and where India is now, trying to make its way in the world are fundamentally different. China grew because it had access to the US market, because the West said, for strategic reasons, let's welcome China. And the problem was Russia, Soviet Union in the 1980s, and that China would help balance Russia. So that's how it began. But after the end of the Cold War, while there was no threat, the US and the Western capital found that China was an easy place to work with. There were no political conflicts, and therefore you could see a dramatic interdependence that began to emerge between China and the US, and China and Europe, and all the major capitalist countries. So that's how China grew. But today they're in a different situation, trying to combat. So, and it is not easy to decouple after having 4 decades of economic interdependence. That's where China's presence is global. It is engaged with everyone, and it has the massive dominance over global exports. In that period, when China was growing, when China connected with the West, at that time we were saying, oh, we are not interested in the West. We don't want to do anything with the West. Our economy doesn't converge with them. So we were in a mood that where we said, look, we like the Soviet Union. So our position in the 80s was not in favor of engaging the West. So China took advantage of that, though India was much more of a semi-capitalist country than China was. But China was willing to suspend trade union rules, make it easy for foreign investment, and open its door in a way that India would never do. So I think that way, there was a historic context in which China grew. But today for India, the problem has been, we thought in the 90s, China was almost give a free pass to China into the WTO. And we thought we were working with China and Russia to deal with the Americans. But the Chinese have simply wiped out India's manufacturing sector. So that leaves, if China is not your natural partner and it is undercutting India's economic growth, therefore the only other major groups are one, which is the EU, which is which we are beginning to talk, but that's going to be quite demanding because of the complexity of negotiating with the Europeans. The US, which is today not doing free trade agreements, but is open to engaging. And then the other countries, Britain, which is out of EU, and the various other countries that you're trying to engage. So there is no political lens here, that once you put China out, the rest of the economy is largely with the Western countries. And within Asia, can we do more things, even though we're not part of RCEP? Can we do bilateral deals of the kind that we're doing today with Australia? Can we replicate that with Japan and others? Is something I'm sure that's not ruled out at this point.
So now, there's the sale of this BrahMos missiles, which is to the Philippines, which has, like you say in the article, that it's unlikely. It will certainly not alter the balance of the military balance of power in any way between the Philippines and China, of course, but it does send out a signal that India is willing to do this. You mentioned this in the piece slightly, but Make in India in defense, which was one of the big planks of Make in India, hasn't quite taken off, even by, these things, of course, do take time, in the sense that it has to be. Do you think that the government has already started a little bit with the Rafale deal and others, but is it time to perhaps push the private sector in defense, perhaps even in international private sector in defense, to just ramp up that capability, both for us and even for this kind of strategic diplomacy?
I think what you said is absolutely right, that you have actually, it's not easy to overnight produce weapons at home. India, if in time of independence, had a fairly significant domestic production capacity, which as we turned inward and we, not interested in exports, so we were not, we were simply buying weapons. So therefore, actually, we were put ourselves in a situation where that we could not produce at home the big weapons, and we kept importing from various suppliers, including Soviet Union, US, most recently. So I think we were completely dependent on outside suppliers. And India, that's how became the world's largest arms importer. But in the last 4 years, 5 years, this government has insisted that, look, we need to do something about it, both for financial reasons, because it's a huge cost, and for eventually strengthening domestic defense production. And as part of that, it is also encouraging private sector to take up production. And most recently, you saw the ordnance factories, not privatized, but corporatized. So there are reforms taking place. These will take time. Meanwhile, some imports will take place because you have a crisis on the border with China. You need to import aircraft. So the armed forces want the best, while you need over the longer term to shift from imports to domestic production. So I think the tension will be there. But if we can start producing internally, that will be a major gain. And we've seen companies like Larsen & Toubro, companies which are beginning to produce weapons inside with Bharat Forge, Tata's. There is today much larger private sector participation, but hopefully this will increase. But in addition to this, that what we face on the political side has been, India was reluctant to export BrahMos. BrahMos was an exception. We had the BrahMos capability for a long time. It was one of the few weapons production deals we did with Russia, and that many countries were interested in Asia, were interested in importing it. But India, for some reason, I mean, probably political reasons, where it said, look, what would China think? Should we export it to China's neighbors? Would it make our relationship with China worse? And I think we seem to have overcome that mental obstacle, and saying, look, okay, we're going to go ahead now. So where you have, capability, why not start there? And there have been reports, including our Indian Express has reported on the growing, focus on exports. Hopefully the idea of a $5 billion target by 2025 will be met, but that's still a pittance. India is today 25th in the list of countries that export weapons. But it's also a problem, for example, our neighbors. All of our neighbors today import weapons from China. Sri Lanka, for example, wants an aircraft. We're not in a position to give them, but the Chinese and the Pakistanis are offering them an fighter aircraft. So I think if we don't move in this direction, one can be domestic production, other is in partnership with others. For example, many countries are going to buy Rafale. Can we work with France to say, look, India would do the servicing. India can do the maintenance and repair of some of these aircraft. So I think we need a lot more innovation as we go along to be able to capture some of this market. And this is not an easy market. It's very hard. It requires a range of instruments, policy instruments that we are only beginning to put in place now.
You talked about the basic argument that you make is that partnerships now, that the US policy document of the Indo-Pacific is no longer, it is not the US, it's not a US which is looking exclusively at bilateral ties, which is how the US has functioned outside of its 3 or 4 major alliances. And at the same time, you're looking at an India which seems to be more open to working in this way. I mean, less insecure about independence or autonomy or strategic autonomy. So how do you see this? But how do you see this after the UK-US, for example? Do you think that India the kind of focus along with the Quad on this Anglosphere thing, for that Anglosphere grouping, the English-speaking sort of countries, should India be attempting to be a part of that kind of grouping as well, in some senses, in some way?
No, I think we are already part of the Quad, and we don't, I don't think the other groups are open at this point. The main point here is, look, how do we build our own domestic capabilities? Because that is one part. That is, we need to strengthen our domestic manufacturing capabilities, whether it is weapons, science and technology, 5G, you name it, across the board. And the other is working in partnerships so that will boost your capability. It will also increase your reach. For example, today, working with the Quad today gives us much stronger engagement with Australia, with Japan, and their contacts. And we're seeing Australia work in India, in South Asia. We're using Australian support to do more efforts in South Pacific. So in that sense, the partnerships help. But it is not just limiting ourselves. But tomorrow, assuming, say, look, we work with France in the Western Indian Ocean. So France is not part of the Anglosphere. France is very keen to develop some cooperation between Delhi, UAE, that is Abu Dhabi, and France. So if you can think of a trilateral coalition that can do things in Western Indian Ocean. If UK, Australia, in the Anglosphere, for example, they all have this so-called Five Eyes intelligence cooperation. They might not, it's a very close grouping, but there are ways in which we can work with them. We should try. So it is not, nobody's ruled out. I mean, what is important is the terms on which we cooperate. So I think that is the key. And there, a stronger India today is in a better position to negotiate those terms of how we work together and how we translate these coalitions into strengthening domestic capacity. So I think that's where, but traditionally, I think we made such a metaphysical thing out of strategic autonomy, as if it is some unique Indian virtue. Every country in the world, that is principle one of it. Every sovereign country tries to maximize its autonomy within the circumstances it finds itself in, small or big. Everybody doesn't have the same level of autonomy. In the old days, we used to say only the US and the Soviet Union were non-aligned or strategically autonomous. Everybody had to operate in certain constraints. Big countries have greater autonomy. Smaller countries don't. But yet, whether it is Maldives, we've seen how Maldives under the previous president Yamin played the China card with great gusto against India. Sri Lanka does it, continues to do it. We've seen in Nepal governments play China against India. So everyone does it. So this idea somehow India is uniquely got this attribute of autonomy is a mythology that we've created for ourselves. And this often then it becomes one of, are we autonomous today or not? Rather than saying, what are my interests? How do I achieve those interests? What are my threats? How do I cope with those threats? So instead of that, we turned it upside down and thinking as if the philosophical proposition is the first thing. And in the process, if you had to sacrifice your interests, we were prepared to do it. And I think that's the tragedy of this whole debate that puts autonomy as some kind of a special virtue. But I would say autonomy is like all birds fly and all fish swim.
Right.
But we know all fish swim, but within that, there are big fish, there are small fish. Yeah. And small fish too, work in groups to fend off big fish. So I think that is the natural mustnaya of the world, if you will. And so therefore the challenge for us is, how do we strengthen ourselves? Not saying, are we pure today? Yeah. Are we strategically autonomous today? Because as the third largest economy today, the fact that we debate itself shows a level of insecurity, which does not behove India's size, its weight in the international system.
Right, sir. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.